It's story time, but this time we're gonna do more of a discussion type story. I think it's a really great time, an important time, to evaluate a suppressed act of war, which was the JFK assassination. So let's get into that. As we know, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy was on November 22nd, 1963. And it is still very controversial, and it's probably one of the most scrutinized events in modern history still. So this case is very interesting to me because I had family who actually did the investigation into the Warren Commission. So the Warren Commission was a group of individuals who were appointed to conduct an investigation into the JFK assassination. The family I'm speaking of were appointed to do an investigation into the Warren Commission's investigation. So while the Warren Commission did conclude that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, there was declassification of government files that have come up over the decades, and it's definitely fueled some doubts and conspiracy theories, which we all know. When the material was actually declassified, there was definitely a lot of reviews. And as the public knows now, there was a lot of compelling truths that had come out in this declassified files, in this declassified material. One of these truths revealed that there was intentionally hidden material, and it was hidden from the public for the survival of the United States and to avoid an all-consuming global war. In other words, I know the public is just as interested in the JFK assassination as I've been, so I'm pretty sure that most of you are aware that Oswald was the shooter, but he did not act alone. And this is the evidence that my family had found while investigating the Warren Commission's investigation into the case. There is very credible evidence from these declassified CIA and FBI documents to support the idea that Oswald was the lone shooter. Also, that he was not acting alone. Lee Harvey Oswald was the triggerman in a larger international plot, and his role was facilitated by foreign intelligence. So it was not a mob hit, guys. It was not the CIA who orchestrated the assassination. Instead, Oswald's connections, travel patterns, and behavior indicated he was working under the influence of hostile foreign actors, mainly Cuba and the Soviet Union. I do know, personally, for a fact, that this intelligence information was withheld. So in other words, when the Warren Commission did their investigation into the JFK assassination, the CIA already had this intel and all the intelligence. And I also personally know this as fact because I am a direct descendant of an individual who was a CIA officer that was investigating Lee Harvey Oswald and his foreign intelligence ties at that time, before the assassination of President Kennedy. I also know personally that it is fact that this information and this intelligence that the CIA had already had was withheld from the public. So in other words, when the Warren Commission did their investigation and released their report on the JFK assassination, that intelligence was withheld. Personally, again, I know this as fact. I am also the direct descendant of other individuals who held high government roles one being on the CIA Transparency and Oversight Committee, and one also who was on the Senate committee. And they were appointed to do an investigation into the Warren Commission report on the JFK assassination. They were appointed because the information that the CIA had known did not come out in the Warren Commission's reports on the JFK assassination. Obviously, there had to be reasons why that wasn't released to the public, and there had to be legitimate reasons. And that is when the CIA Oversight and Transparency Committee steps in, as well as the Senate Committee. So now let's get back to Oswald. So Oswald was radicalized, and he was trained by foreign intelligence. In the months before the assassination, Oswald had become increasingly enriched in the pro-Castro ideology. And he actually trained at a paramilitary camp in Louisiana that was infiltrated by Cuban and pro-communist operatives. And they were posing as Marxists and sympathizers. At the time, these camps were watched by the FBI and the CIA, and they had become breeding grounds for radical activity tied to Cuba interests. Hence why the CIA and my family member, who was a CIA intelligence officer at the time, had already known and had this intelligence before JFK was even assassinated. Also why they were investigating Lee Harvey Oswald. So from there, Oswald's ties kind of deepened, and it led him to Mexico City. And that's where he made contact with Cuban and Soviet intelligence operatives at their respective embassies. Not kidding. This is all documented intelligence that has now been released. So during these meetups, Oswald was believed to have requested assistance for passage to Cuba or the USSR. And, more chillingly, he discussed targeting President Kennedy. And this was not idle talk. There was multiple intelligence intercepts and informant reports from that time suggesting that Cuban intelligence, the DGI, and KGB agents met with Oswald and encouraged his extremist ideologies and his plans to target President Kennedy. There is still a lot of the public who criticizes the CIA's awareness, or that feel they missed warning signs. Government and leadership transparency is important to me, so I have no problem saying that the CIA was very aware of Oswald long before the Plaza. They had already been tracking Soviet spies and monitoring their embassies. They had been collecting signals intelligence from Cuba long before the assassination. I'm not sure if most of the public is aware, but there was intercepted communications and informant tips that led the agency to believe that Oswald posed a potential threat. Again, transparency. There was at least one phone call, and I'm just going to say at least one, that was placed to Washington warning of Oswald's intentions. But there was not enough actionable intelligence to prevent the assassination, if that makes sense. Now, when it comes to the investigation into the Warren Commission investigation and reports of the JFK assassination, the CIA apparently did withhold or downplayed a lot of this intelligence that was known by CIA. And it was found that they did it not to protect themselves or a domestic conspiracy, but because of what full disclosure would have required. So we really have to use some critical thinking here. If it had been made public that Cuba and the USSR had orchestrated the assassination of a sitting U.S. president, what do you think that would lead to? Because the logical and expected response would have been war. So at that time, it wouldn't have just been any conventional war. It would have been nuclear retaliation. You've all heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just 1 year earlier. The world was still teetering on the brink of annihilation. Castro and Khrushchev had already threatened nuclear strikes on American cities. Obviously, the world didn't get nuked, so the existence of Soviet nuclear warheads in Cuba had definitely been resolved. But it was only through Kennedy's delicate diplomacy. Now, with that in mind, the exposure of Cuban and Soviet involvement in JFK's murder would have ignited a national outcry for war. In other words, an act of retribution. In that charged atmosphere of the Cold War, this simply could not have remained conventional, because the U.S. public would have demanded vengeance. A failure of the United States acting would have likely sparked domestic unrest or civil conflict. So, that is the explanation given to as why the files were kept classified. Not to cover up CIA wrongdoing, but to prevent a global catastrophe. If we use our critical thinking to reevaluate the JFK case, the evidence is there. The Kennedy assassination was more than just a murder. It was a covert act of war. And acknowledging it as an act of war would have triggered World War III. So, in suppressing the full truth, the government actually preserved global stability. However, they did do it at the cost of transparency. It is really the secrecy surrounding the JFK files that fueled so much suspicion and distrust from the public, and also where all those conspiracy theories come from. But the real reason for the suppression of the evidence was intentional survival. The truth was really too dangerous to release, and not because it implicated the U.S. in any way, but because it would have justified a war that no one would have survived, in a sense. Bottom line, the American people would have demanded that war. And if the government didn't take action to retaliate against a country for assassinating a sitting U.S. president, then we would have had a civil war. So in all reality, it was more than just one thing that played into the secrecy surrounding the JFK files. There was not only the fear of nuclear war, and it was a real fear, but there was also the fear of civil war. The JFK assassination was not a result of domestic conspiracy. There is plenty of evidence, although it had been suppressed, it is now declassified, that suggests it was a foreign-directed political assassination, and it was orchestrated by Cuban intelligence with the support of Soviet operatives, which then it was carried out through a manipulated and radicalized, but willing, Lee Harvey Oswald. The CIA's suppression of the key intelligence in this case was not a cover-up of their own crime, but a safeguard against nuclear annihilation and civil war. Had the truth been revealed in 1963, the world would have faced a nuclear response from both sides, likely leading to the end of the United States and much of the modern world as we know it. And again, this is all important because if the public had been aware of the evidence that this was a foreign-directed political assassination of a sitting U.S. president, especially one that was so loved by the American people, one like JFK, the American people would have demanded retribution. There was a huge decision that had to be made. That decision was to start World War III for retribution for the assassination of a sitting U.S. president, which would have been an all-out nuclear war. The U.S. would have faced nuclear response from both Cuba and the Soviets. Or they can suppress intelligence and evidence from the American people. The intelligence and evidence that would be suppressed from the American people would be the proof that it was a foreign-directed political assassination. This was a heavy decision to make. Either go to war and start World War III for retribution for the assassination of our sitting U.S. president, knowing it would be a full-out nuclear war and probably the end of the world as we knew it. Or suppress the information, the intelligence, and the evidence, and completely avoid it. So their web of lies may actually have been the greatest silent act of self-preservation the U.S. history has ever known or seen. I think it's very crucial, and we're in a very crucial time where we need to keep the truth of what happened with the JFK assassination in the light, in the public light, and what was actually going on, and why those decisions were made. Not only that, it is a crucial time for us to be aware, and be very aware, of what might be happening on U.S. soil. Now, I know we're not in Cold War era anymore, but it doesn't mean these things have changed. They've never changed. This is foreign intelligence, and this is how foreign intelligence works. They might have adopted new tactics, new ways, but this is something that is continued. And something that intelligence and CIA and the government is fully aware of, and they continue to investigate it and to watch and follow these groups to prevent these types of situations and tragedies from happening. I do believe we're in a time where the U.S. public is going to start seeing a lot more of this activity only due to crimes that we're going to see happening in the U.S., like assassinations and politically motivated homicides, things of that sort. These are not acts of just lone, random acts of violence. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of these acts. We'll find there was more behind the scenes. There was some radicalization. There was involvement with these types of paramilitary groups, similar to what Oswald was involved with. It hasn't gone away. It's just gotten better. As time goes on, technology gets better. It doesn't change. When we take the evidence that we're given and it doesn't make sense and it feels like a cover-up, especially in certain circumstances, there's probably a reason for it. And it's probably not a domestic conspiracy or a domestic cover-up of wrongdoing, government wrongdoing. It's probably a scenario like what we saw with the JFK situation. And we probably will have a lot of situations where we see a lot of evidence withheld from the public. due to the foreign involvement. Again, using our critical thinking skills, we might not be back in the times of JFK. However, we are in a very crucial time and in very crucial positions with other countries. War, for one. So keep it in mind. Do your own research. Don't be so quick to label a conspiracy just because it feels like one, or just because there's evidence being withheld. Because if you dig deeper, you'll always find a reason why. And yeah, some of those reasons why is corruption. A lot of it is. And wrongdoing on people who are involved in high positions in our government. But there are also situations where it is only one or two or few individuals that have been corrupted or that have defected to another foreign intelligence. It's generally not entire agencies that cover things up. And like we've seen with the Warren Commission reports into the investigation with the JFK, when that happens and it feels like a conspiracy, you have to use your critical thinking as to why. Because there's something bigger that the U.S. government is trying to prevent when that is the case. So aside from all the factual and declassified information, this is all opinion. Do your own research. Stay aware and realize the critical time that we're actually living in 2026. It might not be Cold War times, but the tactics of war don't change, especially when it comes to foreign intelligence. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.